Today I want to revisit one of the best shop projects I've ever built, and I base that claim on the feedback of thousands of viewers who have used this design for their own shops. It's simply one of the best ways to organize, store, and even cut plywood, especially if you have limited space and need something that you can move around. This cart is sturdy enough to hold a ton of full sheets, as well as all your smaller offcuts. And it has a unique feature that makes it possible to cut your plywood into more manageable pieces right on the cart. The best part is it can be built with common, inexpensive construction lumber. And while I did use my table saw when I built it, you could make this with just handheld power tools. I've also made a set of plans with all the measurements you need to build it. You can find them at the link below this video or in the plan section of stumpynubs.com. I built this one assembly at a time, cutting the 2x4s and the 2x6s to length, and then I ripped the round edges off. I'm not sure I really needed to do that, but it removes the rough surface left at the mill and makes them look a little nicer in my opinion. In the end, I was really building with 2x3s and 2x5s. Each assembly was put together on the floor because at the time I didn't yet have a bench large enough. I'm using construction screws and I'm making simple butt joints. This base is assembled from 2x5s, but I use one of my 2x3s as a spacer so I can be sure that the distance between these inner rails will snugly fit the boards that will later go between them. Now's a good time to install the big 6-inch casters. I considered adding a block so I could secure them with 4 screws, but with the heavy flanges on these, I think 3 screws will be just fine. I do wish my casters locked though. I may replace them down the road. Because these corner joints will take all the weight of the loaded cart, I did replace the 2 shorter screws that I originally used with 3 longer screws, just in case. Several of the boards on my next 2 assemblies have their corners trimmed off to keep them out of the way. The taper starts about 1 foot from the end, and it brings them down to about 1 inch thick at the point. I originally planned to cut them with a bandsaw, but I found a circular saw was faster, and it gave me a nice straight cut line. I tried to keep each board square to the rails across the end as I worked, but this isn't a precision project, so I wouldn't fret over it too much. The lower rail sets 5 inches from the end of the boards on assembly 2. That way it will rest on top of the base assembly while the protruding ends slip between the slats. I try to keep this assembly plumb as I drive in screws wherever I think they may be needed to secure it in place. It's not going to be perfectly rigid yet, but it'll be strengthened when we install the next assembly. This assembly is labeled number 3 in the plans, and it's pretty straightforward. More screws, more butt joints. The lower rail mounts about 4 inches from the tapered ends, and it's time to install. I made this easy. The lower rails near the tapered ends just sit on the base, and the slats from both assemblies mesh together. Drive some screws here and there to keep everything solid and secure, and you're ready to start the last assembly. That one slips between the remaining rails in the base, and it's screwed in place with the slats flush with the underside. This divides the 2 sections of the cart, so try to use plenty of screws to keep it nice and rigid. The next step depends on your height. Reach up the slanted side of the cart, and without stretching, mark the height of your wrist. Then measure 48 inches down from there and place another mark. That's where you should mount a series of small 3/4 inch thick blocks, 1 on each slat all the way down the cart. At this point, we can use the cart to finish the cart. Get a sheet of plywood and sit it on the blocks you just installed. We're going to make a rip and a crosscut so you can see how it works. Then you can use this process to cut the plywood pieces you need to finish the cart itself. My plywood was a little bowed, so I used a couple clamps to flatten it out, another handy feature of this design. To rip a sheet, measure from the top edge the width of the piece you need. If you're using a clamp-on edge guide like this one, you'll need to add an offset to account for the distance between the guide and your saw blade. But this same cart can be used with a regular track saw if you have one of those, or with a simple homemade saw guide like this one. Whatever you use, set the depth of your saw so the cut just goes through the plywood. You don't want to cut deeply into the cart itself, but a little scoring line here and there is not going to hurt it. If you use a good blade, you'll get a nice clean cut. Making a crosscut is a similar process, but in that case, position the cut between 2 slats so nothing interferes with the guide. I highly recommend you cut from bottom to top, because as you make any cut with a circular saw, the blade guard is going to retract, and you don't want to finish the cut down near your legs with that guard retracted and gravity pulling the saw down toward you. Once you cut your plywood, you can add some pieces to the base of the cart to support the little panels that you'll load in there. And a final piece goes on the front to create a lip. How much plywood you load in this cart depends on how heavy you want to make it. The heavier it is, the harder it will be to move around. But the cart itself should be plenty strong enough for at least as many sheets as you see on mine. I built mine about 4 years ago, and since then, thousands of others have built their own for my project plans. It is a great project that will serve you for a lifetime. Now, you want to see something else really interesting? I've spent quite a while looking for a quality low or no VOC alternative that's easy to apply, that's easy to maintain, and that's safe to use without a respirator. Basically, I want the holy grail of wood finishes. And I think I may have found it. It's called Clean Armor. It was invented by an entrepreneur from Georgia. This is something that absolutely can change how we finish wood. First, this finish cures in 2 minutes. Not just dry to the touch, fully cured, rock hard protection in 2 minutes per coat. That alone blew me away. Then I learned it also contains 0 dangerous VOCs, and it has virtually no smell at all. I can safely put this on in the middle of the house if I wanted to, without a mask or a respirator, and no one's going to complain about the smell. It adheres to itself. So if you ever need to fix a scratch or something down the road, you don't have to strip it off or scuff it with sandpaper so that things like polyurethane would adhere to it. But it's also among the most durable finishes I've ever seen. As you'll see, it's simple to apply with either a cloth, as I'm going to do, or with a brush. You can even spray it, though I'd wear a respirator when I spray anything. Now you may be wondering how a finish that cures in just 2 minutes allows me the time to apply it like this. That's because it only cures under direct UV light. I've got a handheld one here. Now remember, I applied the finish under regular lighting. I turn on the UV light when it's time to cure. But after about 2 minutes, you can touch it and you'll see it's fully cured and ready for another coat. But think of the implications of a 2-minute drying time per coat. This stuff isn't cheap, but it's 100% solids. Everything in the bottle stays on the surface as protective finish. There's no evaporation at all. So a quart of this stuff will cover as much as 3 times the surface area as a quart of poly. 2 or 3 coats is usually enough. And this is done. If it were a piece of furniture, I could deliver and install this right now. It won't stink up the house. It's ready for normal wear and tear. It is really amazing stuff. But Stefan over at mywoodcutters.com did some chemical tests to show you just how durable this stuff is. First, he tried acetone, which is virtually guaranteed to wreck just about any finish out there. Even after several minutes, none of the surfaces showed any damage at all. And remember, this was fresh finish he was testing. Now I realize this won't be for everyone because it's more expensive than other finishes, even though you do get 3 times the coverage. But I think the benefits far outweigh the cost. How much is your time worth, for example? Do you have limited space for drying? Do you share your drying space with your regular workshop and so you have to get that stuff out of there so you can continue to work? Do you need something without harmful fumes and odors? This solves so many problems. I'll put a link to it below this video. See you next time.